The release of College Football 25 has got people so amped up for the upcoming college football season, and you love to see it. So today we're going to do a 2024 Power 4 college football tier list, so maybe you can decide who's going to be the best team to run a dynasty with. This isn't going to be a straight-up dynasty tier list. Maybe we'll do that going forward, but this will be a Power 4 tier list, maybe give you a little bit more information about these teams, so we'll start it from the top. We'll start by taking a look at the team bank. It's going to have every team in the Power 4 conferences. That's the ACC, Big 12, Big 10, and SEC, as well as the Pac-2 with Oregon State, Washington State, and Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish and Independent. We've got our tiers, the title favorites, top contenders, in the playoff hunt, bowl season, below mid, sadly, and rebuilding, which we'll go over as we touch on them. But we might as well start with the top tier, as I think it's the most obvious tier, the title favorites. So looking at the teams in there, we have 5 of them: Georgia, Oregon, Ohio State, Texas, and Alabama. Now, each of these schools I'm not going to linger on too much. I think most people know the deal with them, but I'll touch on maybe a thing or two. Like for Georgia, I think their offensive skill players are really underrated this year. They have Trevor Etienne at running back. They got a guy in Benjamin Urasek. He was an awesome tight end at Stanford that transfers in. They got guys like Oscar Delp, and then Carson Beck at quarterback to distribute the ball to them. I think that's a really underrated aspect. The Ducks, I think, improved their secondary a lot, as did Texas. You talk about some of the big transfers there, Jabbar Muhammad joining the Ducks, and then for Texas, they were able to lure Andrew Makuba from Clemson. So those are two massive additions. At Ohio State, everyone knows what they did. They spent a ton of money on NIL and brought in a bunch of guys to answer all their important questions, specifically at quarterback, which they hope can be answered by the guy they brought in to replace Kyle McCord in Will Howard from Kansas State. And then they've got a guy like Julian Sayin waiting in the wings. And then we have Alabama. This is the team that was the closest call to getting into this tier, but I decided that at the end of the day, you got to give Kalen DeBoer the benefit of the doubt. If you look at what he's done everywhere he's been so far, in a place like Alabama, what he can do even in year one with uncertainty, I'm choosing to believe him, so Alabama's in the title favorites tier. So let's take a look at the second tier, which is the top contenders in college football. Teams that I think are really going to test those teams in the top tier and maybe contend to win their own conference. You obviously have the defending champion Michigan Wolverines in here. There is so much that changed with them this offseason and so much overhaul and so much uncertainty, specifically on the offensive side of the ball. You can't really justify them being any higher than where they are in this second tier, which is a team that still could make a run to the national title game, but a lot has to go right. Kansas State in the Big 12, they did a lot. Adding Dylan Edwards into that backfield with a guy like Avery Johnson with so much untapped potential really makes you think that the ceiling is very high for Kansas State. LSU has a lot of uncertainty. They got to replace Jaden Daniels. They got to replace Brian Thomas. They've got to replace Malik Neighbors. But you've got to believe in that offensive system under Brian Kelly. The defense is also very suspect, but I think they can still outscore teams this year, even if their defense doesn't get up to speed. I think it could, though. They bring in Blake Baker, Missouri's defensive coordinator, who did a great job with the Tigers. I think he can do a great job with the Tigers of LSU. Speaking of Tigers, we've got the Clemson Tigers right there as well. Clemson is a team that has some uncertainty because of the way things were so disastrous on offense, but I think they have all the pieces there to win now. They could win the ACC and turn things around. A lot of people are pretty low on Clemson football right now because of how disastrous last year was. The Utah Utes are sandwiched in there. I think in the Big 12, they're instantly a Tier 1 program that is capable of winning that conference. They're just excellent and physical, and I think that the teams in the Big 12 are not ready for the level of play Utah's at when they have a quarterback, which they didn't have last season, which is why that looks so ugly. Iowa State probably sticks out like a sore thumb to some people here, but I'm really trusting the Cyclones. They have a ton of returning production back. They're a team that develops supremely well. They had a betting scandal they navigated last season. Their schedule gets easier, and they had one of the youngest teams in college football, more freshman snaps played than any other school. So I think Iowa State's going to really come to their own, be one of the biggest surprises in all of college football. Notre Dame's another team that initially was really attractive to me this offseason. They have so many key defensive returnees like Benjamin Morrison, Xavier Watts, and along the line of scrimmage as well, I think they got a lot better. They bring in a really exciting offensive coordinator in Mike Denbrock, who was just at LSU, but I'm a little nervous because that their skill positions, they're a little bit thin, which is exactly what the case was with Clemson last season and what resulted in a really stagnant offense, even though Clemson had an exciting new offensive coordinator in Garrett Riley. So with Notre Dame, it almost feels like it's too much of the whispers of last season's Clemson team for me. Florida State is also in this tier. I think the Seminoles are one of the favorites to win the ACC as well. I think the race between them and Clemson, and we'll touch on Miami in just a second, is going to be really tight. The Noles, I think, are slightly regressed from last season's undefeated regular season team. At quarterback, I think DJ Uiagalelei is a slight downgrade from Jordan Travis. I think defensively, their defensive line won't be as excellent as it was. They still have some great pieces like Patrick Payton, and they brought in some key transfers. But overall, I think they're still equipped to compete. And this is a team that their last season's roster was a bunch of transfer portal players. So it's not necessarily a knock on the Noles that they used the portal to build this year's team. Tennessee's a team that I'm very high on. I think they could easily make a big leap this year. They have the best quarterback I think they've had under Josh Heupel and Nico Iamaleava. I think that'll easily be able to be said by the time his career is done, but I think it could be said this season, and if he goes out and proves that, it's going to mean Tennessee's ceiling is sky high. They were playing great defense last season as well, and I think they're going to be very capable of doing that with James Pierce Jr. again this season. Miami, the Hurricanes, another team that sticks out. They're kind of like Iowa State. Not a lot of people are going to have them in this tier. It's another team I'm taking a swing on. They went out, they got Cam Ward, they got Damian Martinez, they got some key defensive pieces as well. Tyler Barron, one of those guys from that Tennessee defensive line. They are equipped to do a lot this year. They also have a guy like Ruben Bain that as a freshman was amazing for their defensive front. At the line of scrimmage, Miami's great. If they can play great situational football and they can avoid some of those insane mental errors that have made them so infamous under Mario Cristobal, I think they're a team that can win the ACC, and the odds reflect that, and I think a lot of things reflect that on and off the field. Penn State is in this tier as well. It's the tier they've lived in over the last couple of seasons. They're hoping that their key difference can be this year. They brought in Andy Kotelnicki, who was the offensive coordinator at Kansas. They're hoping that he can unlock something with this Penn State squad, get the Nittany Lions into a playoff spot, and get them to win some of those big games. They need Drew Aller to grow and continue to grow at quarterback as well. Missouri's in a situation where they have a lot of those big-time skill players like Luther Burden. They've got Brady Cook all back. Their defense still looks pretty intact. They did, unfortunately, lose their defensive coordinator, Blake Baker, but they're pretty confident with how they replaced him with a really deep staff that Drinkwitz has built over several years, which is the added benefit of being at a program that long, is being able to build those things. And then last but not least is Ole Miss. Ole Miss is the trendy national title pick this year, which is an insane statement to say, but Lane Kiffin has them in a position to win now. They've got a veteran quarterback in Jackson Dart. They've got Juice Wells and Trey Harris at receiver. At running back, they've got Ulysses Bentley. The offense will be potent. The questions for me come down to this defense, and this team tried to address them in the portal. They bring in Walter Nolan for the defensive line. They really loaded up. They are all in. You'd love to see a team with their chips at the center of the table like this. We will see what happens with Ole Miss, but it's probably the best team Ole Miss has ever had. So this takes us to our next tier, which is in the playoff hunt. That means something a little different this year. It's a 12-team playoff as opposed to a 4, so the field is going to be a little wider. We start with USC. The Trojans are a team that's a little uncertain. The thing that keeps me from putting them in the top contenders tier is the fact that they are undergoing a philosophy change, at least according to everyone, because they brought in D'Anton Lynn. He's looking to overhaul the defense. I don't think this is an overnight change. USC isn't suddenly just going to be good at defense tomorrow. I think it may take several years before we see it come into effect. The offense, I think, will still be great, but the defense, honestly, could get worse before it gets better. But if you're an optimist, you could say it's going to change right away and put USC into a straight-up contender this season. Texas Tech is a team that gets made fun of for being very highly touted in the offseason and then they crumble, but I do think it's because of Joey McGuire, and I do think that we're going to see the culmination of what he's built this season. They've got Baron Morton, which is his guy at quarterback. They've got a guy in Taj Brooks coming back. They've got a lot of their best pieces back, hoping to run it back and have a great season. They also brought in an impressive piece like Jalen Conyers from Arizona State at tight end and Josh Kelly from Washington State. I think those are going to be great weapons to have, and I think a lot is adding up for Texas Tech. They'll be in the hunt. Oklahoma is a team that in the SEC, it's going to be a little uncertain with how strong that schedule is. There are concerns at the offensive line. I know Sooners fans think the offensive line will be just fine. There's a scenario where it's not just fine. And if that's the case, then Jackson Arnold is going to really struggle to grow into his own. However, there is good reason to believe the defense will be the strength of Oklahoma this season. If they can hang their hat on that, they can have an excellent year and be in that hunt. NC State, what a trendy pick they are. Grayson McCall at quarterback. They brought in Waters from Duke last season, the running back who's absolutely fantastic. I just blanked on his first name. I think it's Jordan Waters. And NC State, I think, is in an excellent position to make a run in the ACC. Not a lot of people are talking about them. Miami's a more trendy pick. Florida State's a more trendy pick. Clemson's a more trendy pick. And yet NC State has been knocking on the door at breaking out for so long, and I think that Dave Dorn and company could do that. Which takes us to a couple more hot-button teams. Syracuse. What they did this offseason with Fran Brown was pretty remarkable. It's not going to mean any guaranteed wins. They do have a very friendly schedule. I think they could be like the Louisville of last season, where they win a bunch of games because of how friendly that schedule is. They don't even have to be that fantastic. They're not going to be asking too much of Kyle McCord. I think a lot of the pieces they brought in through the portal are going to help them try to be great right off the bat, but it's not a lock by any means. Virginia Tech, Kyron Drones, and a ton of returning production. I think they're capable of having a big breakout year. Brent Pry has done fantastic things, and the way they ended the season, what they're doing, if you're paying attention, the Hokies are going to be right there in the thick of things. Nebraska is another team. It's scary to say in the playoff hunt. They haven't made a bowl game in so long. It's ridiculous for Nebraska football, but Dylan Raiola, if he can be the truth, this defense is going to be like a top 10 defense in college football, and the offense just has to do better than they did last season, and they can flip like 3 or 4 games, which is 100% in the playoff hunt in a 12-team era. Texas A&M is another hot-button team that you'll roll your eyes at seeing them in a tier like this. We've been saying about them for years, but the key factor here is they don't have Jimbo Fisher. They have a guy like Mike Elko who has been a substance over flash guy. He won 9 games in his first year at Duke. And yes, that's the ACC. This is the SEC. There's so much more talent on this roster at A&M. We could see a similar season where A&M turns it around, wins 8 games or something like that, or 9 games, and Texas A&M is a contender right in the thick of the playoff race. I think that's completely possible, and I think something like that is realistic with a guy like Connor Wegman at quarterback. The talent is there to win right now. Arizona and the Wildcats had a lot of uncertainty this offseason. They lose their coach, Jed Fish, but they do bring in a guy in Brent Brennan that I think built a pretty underrated staff. They keep some key players in town like T-Mac and Noah Fafita, and I think those guys are going to keep the offense very potent. The defense, they've got a guy like Traden Stukes in their secondary that I think can be really excellent. However, the defensive front is where I'm concerned with Arizona. We'll see if that holds up in Big 12 play. Kansas is a team. The concern there is that they lost Andy Kotelnicki, their offensive coordinator, but they still have so many offensive skill players that you almost feel like they won't necessarily feel the full brunt of that blow because they have Jaden Daniels, because they have Devin Neal, and the defense is as good as it's ever been under Lance Leipold. Look for their linear climb to possibly continue this season, which is a pretty big statement to say considering they won 9 games last season. Wisconsin and the Badgers, Luke Fickell tried to blend his scheme with the old scheme at Wisconsin last year. It did not work out. I think this year they're going to continue to push Luke Fickell's style of play and offense, and I think they have a little bit more of the guys that they can work with this year. If Tyler Van Dyke can come into his own and ball like he did at Miami all those years ago now, maybe Wisconsin can make some serious noise. Louisville had one of the top transfer portal classes in the entire country, and that's coming off of an ACC title game appearance. I do think their schedule gets a little tougher. Last season, it was very, very manageable. However, they're still a team that you cannot sleep on. Iowa, their defense is fantastic. Their offense, I don't think it can be worse than last season. Luke Lachey is going to be healthy. They're also going to have a healthy Cade McNamara and a backup option in Brendan Sullivan. And for that reason, I just think they can only go up from here. Oklahoma State is a team I'm a little concerned about. Their defense was spotty at best last season. Their offense, they had inconsistent quarterback play and a very turnover-prone attack. They won a ton of close games. And for that reason, I'm not as high as some people are on the Cowboys with a ton of returning production, a team that was in the Big 12 title game last season. But we'll see. Maybe I'll be proven wrong by Gundy's blood magic, as he's done so frequently. I still think they'll probably be in the playoff hunt. I just don't think they're a lock to win the Big 12, or I don't think they will win the Big 12. And last but not least in this tier, we have UCF. I think that this is a team the Knights you need to really watch out for. They added so much talent, especially in the late spring portal window. Not a lot of people noticed, but Gus Malzahn is cooking with gas, and UCF is here to stay and to compete in the Big 12. I think they're an instant contender in the Big 12. So we've arrived in the bowl season tier. These are teams that I think are more likely than not going to end in a bowl game. It's not an exact science, the tier name, though, because some of these teams have more difficult schedules. That might result in them missing a bowl game, but they're still above some of the teams in the tiers below them. But let's get into it. Minnesota under PJ Fleck has been very concerning. They've been extremely inconsistent in the last couple seasons, losing games they shouldn't lose, winning games they shouldn't win, stuff like that. it's just not a reason to have great faith in them. They do bring in Max Brosmer. They do have a slightly improved roster from that 6-7 finish last season, but we'll see what happens with them. The Florida Gators have the talent there to win, and they would be a bowl team in most conferences. In the SEC, I don't know. Everyone's talked about their gauntlet of a schedule. We'll see what happens. Graham Mertz needs to perform. If he can't, they need to insert Lagway, and they need these young players to perform right now. The Washington Huskies, they're probably going to make a bowl game. They do have a pretty tough schedule. They've got a guy like Will Rogers at quarterback, but they did lose so much this offseason through the transfer portal and through losing that coaching staff. Jed Fish is a great coach, but I don't know if in year one he's going to have what it takes to just instantly squeeze wins out of this team. So they're probably going to be like a 6 or 7 win team. Michigan State could be a similar case here. Jonathan Smith looked like he had a pretty intact roster, especially with the guys he brought from Oregon State, but they did lose a ton from that defensive line late in the portal window, and that could show down the stretch for Michigan State. I don't know if they'll make a bowl game, but I'm going to say fringe bowl contender as well. South Carolina is the same thing. Lenora Sellers and guys like Nick Harbor, I think, can really help this team play Beamer ball in a way we've never seen before. I think South Carolina will will their way into a bowl game. It's by no means a lock, though, but I'm weirdly optimistic about the Gamecocks' chances for 2024. North Carolina is in a post-Drake May world. Mac Brown is going to have to push the margins with these coordinators. He was already preparing for life without Drake May. He knows a player like that doesn't come around very often. I think North Carolina can parlay that into a bowl appearance, especially with a guy like Omarion Hampton. They just need to figure out quarterback play, ironically. Rutgers has so much back. They've got an easier schedule than last season. Greg Schiano's style is really being ingrained into this team, and they're really taking on the personality of their coach, and I think Rutgers is pretty much a lock for a bowl game this season. Kentucky, the Wildcats had a kind of underrated offseason. They bring in Brock Vandegrift. They bring in a guy like Chip Trainum at running back. They really rebuilt this team using the portal to fix some holes. And they also have guys like Deion Walker that are true difference makers on the defensive side of the football. Mark Stoops, I should say, has a formula that works, and we're seeing it work, and I think they're going to continue to reload every season into at least a bowl team. We've got Arkansas as well. Sam Pittman given another year, another life. I don't know if it's going to work out. They have Bobby Petrino as their OC. I don't know if Arkansas is going to make a bowl despite the fact that they're in the bowl season tier. In fact, I think it's more likely than not that out of South Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, we see 2 of those teams miss a bowl game. But I do think they're just slightly better than some of the teams that are going to be in the tier below them. SMU is a team that's moving to a power conference, which is a little suspect in my opinion. Whenever those teams are moving up, I don't know if they're going to make a bowl game. We saw 3 out of the 4 that did that last season did not make a bowl game, despite considerable buzz on the positive side for them the whole offseason. So we'll see what happens with the Mustangs. They are a talented team, and I do think they may be better than each of those 4 teams that were promoted last season in terms of how well they're equipped to compete. Maryland's another team that could be in a transition year under Loxley. I would say they are a bowl lock still. Some uncertainties at quarterback, ironically, even though Loxley's been a quarterback whisperer. So that's kind of a good uncertainty when your staff is good at whipping up those guys into shape at that position. TCU, I think, will be back and improve. Their offense will be a lot more potent. We'll see probably closer to the mean of what things will be like under Sonny Dykes for TCU, which is just a solid performance overall, much more solid than we saw last season where they were on the wrong end of a lot of one-score games. Auburn is an interesting one. They're going to have a really young team in several positions, and I think they're still going to make a bowl game. They've got talented players, but it's just not enough overall to push them to being in a playoff hunt or anything like that. Georgia Tech, exciting on offense. That is going to be what this team is. They bring in the defensive coordinator from Duke last season who had a great season, and if he can start to turn things around for Georgia Tech defensively, the Yellow Jackets could raise their ceiling considerably. Haynes King, I think, is one of the most underrated players in the whole country. Oregon State is an interesting case study. They lost a ton of talented players, replaced them with some slightly less talented players, but I think they have the pieces to put together with a Mountain West schedule to easily get into a bowl game, and I think it's kind of a similar story for Washington State. The Cougars are a team that lost a considerable amount as well, but overall still has enough talent in a Mountain West schedule. So it's a very similar story as the Beavs, their Pac-2 counterparts. Cal is another team to keep an eye on. I think that Fernando Mendoza, this offense with Jaden Ott is going to be really potent. They've got to continue to figure out the defense. If they can in the ACC, they can be a team that is a dark horse in that conference. And last but not least, we have West Virginia. They were really excellent last season. It was a very impressive season to have, especially with so many people so low on them in the offseason. And they've given Neil Brown another life, and I think West Virginia, with that other life, will at least make a bowl game. Garrett Green, if he can click, if this defense can click, West Virginia could also see themselves elevating into dark horse status. So next we're at the below mid, sadly, tier. Now, this is an unfortunate term to describe these schools that I think more often than not will not be making a bowl game this season. You start with a team like Purdue. I really actually like Ryan Walters as a coach. He's still very young. This team, this roster is still very young. They've got a guy in Hudson Card there, and Devin Mockabee at running back. I still think they could win some games and can be competitive in the Big Ten, but I think they're more of a window program in this stacked Big Ten, and this just isn't their window this year. Could be next year, though, especially if they invest in the offseason. Mississippi State under Jeff Lebby, it's Lebby's first season. They're not exactly ripe with talent, and I just don't think anything crazy will happen. I just don't think they make a bowl game, and that's just most likely what's going to happen. Wake Forest is a team under Dave Clawson that had a pretty disastrous year last year. Could be a sign of things to come. We'll see. They're not exactly a program built to thrive in a portal NIL era, so we'll see what happens. As far as X's and O's, they do have a guy in Donovan Greenback that's really talented. They'll have Hank Bachmeier at quarterback, so there could be some upside offensively and defensively, a really sound system there overall. Boston College brings in Bill O'Brien. They lose Jeff Hafley to the NFL, the Green Bay Packers randomly. Some of them think Bill O'Brien's an upgrade. I think he could be long-term. Is this team built to win right now and compete with a much tougher schedule than they had last season? I'm not so certain. I think Castellanos has a lot of potential to be excited about, but he was still very inconsistent last season. Duke is another team. Duke kind of reminds me of last year's Purdue team. They've got an exciting new coach in Manny Diaz. They've got an exciting new quarterback in Malik Murphy. It might make them a trendy pick to do something, but I just don't think that's happening this season. There's just a lot of unknown variables with Duke. That roster got a little shredded this offseason. Pitt is another team. They bring in a new offensive coordinator. They're hoping to do some stuff, but there just aren't a lot of players that you think can make this offense better. I think defensively they can get back to what they're doing, but once again, the portal was not friendly to Pitt, and it hasn't been friendly to Pat Narduzzi and company. Baylor's another interesting one. They bring in Jake Spavital to hope to fix this offense, but if it doesn't get fixed, it's going to be really ugly. And I think Baylor last season was so ugly that Aranda is very much on the hot seat this year. And if there's signs of trouble, he could be gone, which is why I think a bowl game isn't super likely. BYU is banking on improvement along the trenches. They've got to improve their depth. They've got to be better there. That was one of the biggest differences last season for BYU and why they missed a bowl game. They're going to be cutting it close. That's all I can say. It's going to be razor thin just like it was last season. We'll see what happens with them. They're hoping to find some margins and push some margins in the right area, but still a lot of unknowns for the Cougars. I think they're still adjusting to the power conference life. Northwestern's a super interesting case study. They won 8 games last season and under David Braun, and he didn't even have his coaches or his players. And so he's going to have a lot more of the things he wants and be building towards the way he wants to play. Will that translate into wins in a tougher schedule and a tougher conference than last season? We'll see. Illinois went 5-7 last year, and this year I think the team is about the same. A bunch of great defensive talent, some key offensive players that can make some noise. However, in a Big Ten that just gets tougher every day, I think they're going to slip through the cracks as well. Colorado, I think, is a slightly better version of last year's team. I think their skill players got a little better. I think their trenches are a lot better than the just poverty it was last year, but I still think that overall their depth is lacking, and as the season wears on, we're going to see that. You've just got to recruit to build a program to be sustained over the long term, and Dion is not doing that. And then we have Arizona State. I love Kenny Dillingham. I think he's a brilliant young offensive mind, but it remains to be seen if he can rebuild the program. They were so injured last season, there's almost not a lot you can take away. So the Sun Devils in the below mid-tier. So we're at the final tier, which is the rebuilding tier. Formerly, I called this the bad tier, but I feel like that's a little disingenuous to where these teams are. A lot of them are just rebuilding, like UCLA, hiring a guy in Deshaun Foster. I don't think anyone's expecting him in his first year of legit coaching to just completely turn things around. It was a weird hire. They're clearly going to give him some time potentially, unless he was a sacrificial lamb, which is just a completely different story. But the roster, not ready to win, especially in the Big Ten. Houston's another team. The roster's in a terrible spot under Willie Fritz. Willie Fritz is a great coach, though. We saw him do great things at Tulane the last couple seasons. He'll need time as well. At Vanderbilt, they lost a ton through the portal. They tried to reload where they could. Clark Lee, it feels like, is a little bit in scramble mode. Vandy may be hitting the reset button soon. Same deal with Cincinnati. Scott Satterfield's first season was a disaster. They're in kind of a weird spot. Feels like Satterfield could be close to a hot seat already. They did try to do what they can. They bring in Brennan Sorsby. They've got Luke Kandra on the offensive line. There is some talent here to be somewhat excited about, but overall for Cincinnati, it's mostly looking downhill. Stanford is another team that is rebuilding. Troy Taylor doing what he can with the Cardinal. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a positive. They're going to start to improve. However, this is another rebuilding year for them, despite some talented young players on that team like Alec Ayomanor. Virginia is a team that has a ton of production back. This is the year to circle on your calendar if you're Tony Elliott. Will it be enough? I don't think so. I don't think he's the right guy for that job. I don't think that program is going to keep him around much longer. And then we have Indiana. The Hoosiers bring in Curt Cignetti. It's a great hire. Roster, they did what they could to bring in some guys to try to win this year. I just don't think it's necessarily going to happen in the Big Ten, so they are in the rebuilding tier as well. So there it is, the complete Power 4 tier list of every team in the ACC, Big Ten, Big 12, SEC, Pac-2, and Notre Dame. Let me know down in the comments what you think of this list. Going to be dropping a group of 5 tier list a little bit later. The season gets ever closer, and College Football 25, where you can play as all these teams, gets closer and closer. So let me know down in the comments what you think, what you would change, and I will see you guys later this week.